Hi, everyone. I wanted to share a little bit today about the relationship between privilege and isms. In essence, privilege blinds us to isms. So, privilege blinds us to sexism, and white privilege blinds us to racism. Able-bodied privilege blinds us to ableism. So, for every privilege that exists, there's also a discriminatory behavior or ism that follows, and having that type of privilege makes it much more difficult to see that ism in progress. So, if you followed my primer on privilege for Fancy 2020, then this is building on that idea. So, as you may remember from that video, privilege exists when one group benefits from a policy or practice and another group doesn't, simply based on identification with that group. Privilege is not earned, and having it or not having it, you can't have it if you don't have it, and you can't make it go away either. Um, so, assuming those basics are kind of agreed upon truths at this point, then I'd like to build on that talk and just share a little bit more about how white privilege blinds white people in particular to systemic racism. And I'm obviously making this video in light of the New York Times article that broadcast our issue of lacking diversity to the nation and the world. And what quickly followed was a dismissive and privileged response. And while this issue is bigger than any one author's response, I think that it's really important to understand the connectedness between privilege and systemic isms, in this case, racism. So, I guess the first point that I want to make is that neither privilege nor systemic racism are individual level issues. That is, they are group level issues. So, systemic racism is a form of covert racism, right? You can't see it, it's not obvious. It lurks in the policies and practices that give some people privilege and others don't. So, I want to explain how systemic racism operates in dietetics because it isn't so obvious. That's why it's called covert, right? So systemic racism is not always obvious to people in dietetics, but it exists. Directors of DPD, coordinated programs, and now future education model programs, aka those housed in higher education settings, are the true gatekeepers of the profession in that they are the point of entry. Before an individual even applies for a major, systemic racism has impacted who is at that table, who is declaring that major. And yes, program directors need to take an active role in recruiting and retaining students of color in their program. But program directors also need to be cognizant of the systemic barriers that prevent some individuals from even getting to their programs, getting to declare that major in the first place. Directors have some control as to who enters their program and who does not. And obviously, active recruitment is always a good strategy. So, if you're at an institution, say, and your DPD program is comprised entirely of white students, I'd really urge you to consider if you're doing enough active recruitment. And if you are, then are you actively recruiting from the spaces where BIPOC individuals are choosing to be? Um, and if I would urge you to consider those things. So there's actions that individual program directors can take. But DPD directors don't have total control, and that's where systemic racism is at play. So DPD directors, as I'm sure many of you know, are beholden, to ASEND and to the standards that ASEND sets, right? So that dictates to a degree which students get into the DPD program and which students don't. In other words, DPD directors are required. Not in other words, let me give an example. DPD directors are required to have a certain percentage of their students apply to dietetic internships. And that's a measure for accreditation, right? Every year there's an annual report that DPD directors submit. And on that report, they have to state how many students went on to graduate level nutrition coursework, how many went on to a dietetic internship, how many went on to something else in the field, how many left the field of nutrition altogether, etc. So all of this is to maintain program accreditation. And there are goals, again, to meet. the goal of DPD programs from ASEND is to train people to go to dietetic internships. Um, so there are other standards too, but I'm just using this example of persisting to the DI as one example. The DI, and I'm using it as the example because the DI is obviously cost prohibitive, right? So I'll get there. Um, but so for some people who are involved with a very diverse DPD program, it's important that the students admitted to the DPD demonstrate an intention to go on to the DI, just as it is for all students. Um, but some program directors don't have any challenges in meeting that standard, and some do. If the numbers start to fall, then the DPD program is at risk of losing accreditation. So, just the fact that ASIN requires for accreditation that DPD directors, program directors meet certain criteria for who applies to a DI, which is cost prohibitive in and of itself because just the application fees add up. But that makes entry into a DPD program a policy concern because it prevents some individuals from persisting, even if they might be great candidates for state licensure or for other routes that enable them to pursue a career in nutrition. If the cost of entry to the profession is insurmountable for some students, then it's going to be nearly impossible for the DPD director to recruit and retain them effectively. And that is a systemic barrier. It is not one that individual DPD directors have control over. So there are these individual level barriers about active recruitment and retainment on program levels, but there are also these systemic barriers that prevent some people from persisting in the field and others. And this one is kind of a more obvious one, which is why I chose to use it as my example today. Um, and it may even be pretty obvious to you in thinking about it like this, or maybe it's already occurred to you that this is a classist policy, right? Those people who can literally afford it progress, and those people who can't afford it don't progress. This is, obviously there are some internships with stipends, et cetera. But I'm just talking about the average DPD to DI pathway. So perhaps we can all just agree on that the cost of the DI alone is a systemic barrier that allows the entry of people of higher socioeconomic status and is a real burden for people of lower socioeconomic status. So it's classist in that way. And many people might fail to see how this is also a racist policy. So I want to spend a minute or two on that. So historically, BIPOC individuals have had less access to money, including the opportunity to earn it, to accumulate it, and to engage in behaviors to grow it. For instance, school segregation led to underfunding education, particularly in BIPOC communities. And those families were also experiencing redlining and living just generally in neighborhoods with fewer resources as a result of this redlining and other underfunding, other strategies, systematic strategies of underfunding by BIPOC communities. As a result, fewer BIPOC people pursued and completed higher education, and then as a result of those unequal educational opportunities, BIPOC individuals were not as qualified for higher earning jobs. And all of this matters. But also, even if they had been given the same educational opportunities, business loans and things to start programs to grow your own wealth were more available to white people anyway. BIPOC individuals were consistently and kind of systematically given more opportunities despite equal qualifications as compared to their white peers. And as a result of all of these things, BIPOC individuals didn't have as much opportunity to grow and accumulate wealth. And this issue persists in modern day forms of racism, right? We know that wage disparities exist. And we know that on average, BIPOC individuals earn less than white people for the same job, given the same qualifications, which which means this problem will persist, right? They will have fewer opportunities to earn a higher income and accumulate wealth. White men earn the most of all, and Black women earn the least. So systemic racism maintains disparities in who has access and who doesn't. And okay, so to be clear, this is a very like quick and rough and totally incomplete picture. I'm just trying to draw the broad strokes to make this connection between privilege and racism and how difficult it can be to really dig down and uncover the root of some of these issues. So to get back to the point, ultimately, program directors who receive no applicants from marginalized groups should realize that they have a role in low numbers of BIPOC individuals in their programs. It's important to actively recruit and create a space for people who are not white, and or for people who are not able-bodied, or for people who are not cisgendered. You know, all of the isms, all of the groups, in order to create a sense of belonging, program directors have a role in creating that space. But doing that still won't address the systemic issues that we have. And the cost of the dietetic internship is not the only one. It is one that has a disproportionate impact on people by race due to the fact that the lower wealth accumulation of BIPOC individuals stemming from racism. Because systemic racism is not about individuals, solutions focused solely on individuals are not going to address the systemic problems. In addition, white privilege makes it really difficult to understand that the experiences of BIPOC individuals are inherently different than the experience of white individuals unless somebody is really looking to understand that. Um, in other words, people with privilege are living in a different world than those without privilege. And to understand the differences of these worlds, we really need to be able to get at the assumptions, the norms, the values embedded in daily life in this country, in this world, and in this place. Those values and assumptions are white normative values and assumptions, because white people have a disproportionate amount of power and wealth, or at least, you know, in part related to wealth. And so when your personal values align with societal values, your world looks very different than a society in which you aren't the norm, where your values and ideals aren't so readily accepted. You can refer back to my first privilege video if you want to know more about that, I guess. But I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that in order to really understand your own perspective, and to be empathetic to the experiences of others, especially in the dietetic space, requires a critical perspective. It's all about operationalizing critical thinking, which is kind of funny to me because it's what I encourage students to do all the time. But when we look critically at our history, at the history of our profession, which gave women the opportunity to work when there really wasn't a place for women, we also need to understand how that opportunity was created. We want to certainly celebrate the women, and creating a caveat for women in the workplace, but the women who started this profession did so on or by marginalizing, diminishing, and dismissing women of color. And moreover, some of the earliest dietetics programs were founded where eugenics work was central to business. So, eugenics work, for those of you who may not be familiar, was founded to breed a more superior human population. And the desirable characteristics of that population were white, Christian, educated, and wealthy, or at least have some wealth. So BIPOC individuals, or people with disabilities, or people who are impoverished, or were judged to be inferior. And in this eugenics context, to be clear, some were even sterilized. The work was deeply, deeply racist and classist, and so I don't want to. I want to make sure that we have an accurate characterization of how this profession was founded. Some of the literature even indicates that the U.S. eugenics movement was just as bad as the beginning of the Nazi regime, but obviously didn't lead to the mass genocide of the Holocaust, for a multitude of reasons, which are obviously tangential to this video. So all of this is to say that the founding of the profession was really good for white women. And again, we want to be celebrating careers that put female workers on the map. But we also need to realize that we have a history of subjugating and further marginalizing people, particularly BIPOC, excuse me, women, and thus creating a rift between white dietitians and BIPOC women. So when trying to understand why the demography of dietetics is so skewed, it's really important to take a historic look. And when we look at our history, it's really easy to see that we are a profession founded on racism. We had segregated internship and we tracked BIPOC individuals and students into food service work. And created a system of expensive internships for relatively low pay. So it's actually not all that surprising that we're a profession of mostly white, cisgendered, hetero, able-bodied women. It shouldn't really be surprising. And I personally feel like we should be really thankful that others even want to join this profession at all, despite the Academy's longstanding commitment to diversity and inclusion and cultural competence. We're really failing at those things. We're not diverse, as evidenced by our poor numbers of people who identify as BIPOC. But it's not only going by the numbers. There are other ways that we can see this come out, also tangential to this video. But if we're not diverse, by definition, we are therefore not inclusive. And we're not culturally competent either. We, mostly white people, are really trying to address diet-related disease, and we're doing an overall poor job. People who are suffering most are BIPOC individuals, and our evidence-based work is not resulting in significant change. Either our work is not so evidence-based at all, or we're doing it wrong, or both. And both of these things relate back to racism or to other isms. So our evidence base for prevention is really based mostly on correlational research performed on white people. And we, mostly white RDNs, but the profession generally, are creating nutrition education for BIPOC individuals. And surprise, surprise, we're missing the mark. People are not on average healthier as a result of the millions of dollars being poured into various forms of nutrition education. And so it's kind of hard to argue that we are culturally competent when we even get down to those individual level programs. We see major metropolitan hospitals that have nutrition education materials in only 1 or 2 or 3 languages, or they don't offer a variety of culturally appropriate foods to patients. We use SNAP Ed materials, and those are developed targeting broad generic audiences that reduces people to overgeneralized groups like Black people or Hispanic people. And that fails to address the myriad nuances within these groups. And we try to do needs assessments, of course, if we're adhering to best practices and starting a program from scratch. But many of us aren't doing that. And we're trying to engage community health workers. But why are we turning to community health workers who are typically BIPOC individuals who are underpaid because of their lack of formal education? We should have a profession open and diverse enough to meet our own needs and pay people fair wages, either for their formal knowledge of nutrition or of health, or for their ability to cultivate relationships with community members, which is so valuable. And, obviously, as a sidebar, we need better research. Why isn't the biomedical literature about racial differences in the glycemic response to glucose not discussed in many MNT courses? I've never seen it in any literature that the Academy has put forth, but also, in fairness, I may have missed it because I'm not involved in MNT. So I probably shouldn't even say that. To be clear, we need to stop dismissing our BIPOC friends and colleagues who are screaming that we have a problem. For all of our counseling strategies aimed to train us to listen and to be empathetic, we're doing a terrible job of listening and being empathetic ourselves. We must look inward and outward to examine these policies and practices that marginalize people, systemic racism, systemic policies, and inward to our own assumptions, our own values, and our own privileges. Doing this work is hard. You will make mistakes. I teach about this. I research this. I lead a social media group about this. Join hashtag inclusive dietetics on Facebook, everybody. But my point is not for you to join the group. My point is to say that I also am constantly learning. And I'm trying to deepen my understanding all the time. Do I make mistakes and sometimes even feel foolish or embarrassed or like my privilege is showing? All the time. And also, every day, some people see it and some people don't. And it's a truly humbling experience when it happens. And it's difficult and I'm uncomfortable. And, all of my personal things come up, but that doesn't matter in the bigger picture. That's part of this work. And also, it's still a lot easier because I have so much privilege and I move through this profession and life with assumed belonging because of the white privilege that I hold. I have less debt than my BIPOC peers and more unearned credibility. And I feel deeply, deeply obligated to leverage that. Dietetics has problems, but a lack of writing recommendations isn't one of them. If we truly want to see our change on a broad level, we need to address the systemic barriers that people face in addition to these individual level barriers. It seems like it can't go without saying, but racism is real. Some people in our profession are actively anti-racist. Some people are outright racists. And some people have been the victim of racism in the form of tokenizing, microaggressions, micro insults, or outright demeaning, blatant hate speech. And many are subject to systemic racism daily and in covert forms. And if you don't believe that, then the work that you will do will remain blind to the true struggles that BIPOC individuals face, and you will continue to be ineffective in working with people who aren't white. So I really urge you to think about and consider privilege and the ways in which systemic racism operates in dietetics. We need to have these discussions if we really want to move this profession forward. Thanks for listening.